What's up? This is gonna be a continuation of my A.T.R series. Now I got a few people, which I kind of knew was gonna happen, actually, about my thoughts on IFA, and I knew this was gonna happen because IFA, in my opinion, probably is. And IFA, when I'm talking about IFA, I'm talking about the spirituality of the Yoruba. So you could call it Lukumi if you want, as well, or the Lukumi spirituality. Um, in a sense, it's probably currently the most popular of this A.T.Rs that I could think of, especially in the diaspora. Um, I think there's several reasons why it's probably the most popular. I think if you look at where the religions spread, like after the slave trade in Latin America, yes, there's still a stigma about practicing it, and the stigma still exists because, for instance, most people know it as Santeria, and Santeria is a term that outsiders use. Like you use it, but usually if you're using the term, it's still gonna probably be you probably practicing the version of the spiritual system that is heavier in the saints, or the saints are more visible. Once you start talking about Regla De Ocha or Lukumi spirituality, um, it's either gonna be way more Yoruba, or you're not gonna see the Catholic stuff at all, right? So you know, it's and I would say in Latin America, even though there's a stigma, it's still not as much a stigma as is in other regions, right? So I could give you a perfect example. If I'm even now, like if I listen, I tend to try to listen to music from all over the diaspora, right? So whether it's from Jamaica, Colombia, Peru, Haiti, Trinidad, I listen to music from all over, right? And perfect example when you listen to the music, the Yoruba spirituality is far more prevalent in the Latin American territories than it is in even in the English speaking Caribbean, right? If I'm listening to a song, right, whether it's like a soca song or even I'm not gonna even say dance, but let's say reggae, it's gonna be much more rare. And again, I know in Jamaica it's more obia, right? But even in the Caribbean, if you look at obia outside of Jamaica, and even to some extent in Jamaica, obia, which is a con spirituality, maybe Igbo as well, it tends to be more mixed with the Orisha system, right? So a lot of people who practice Obeah will still worship the seven African powers. So when you understand that fact, you don't hear it in the music as much because it's more underground. For instance, Obeah in a lot of Caribbean countries is actually illegal. In Haiti, it's voodoo. It's a different system. Now in Haiti, I would give them this. Their version of voodoo is actually there's some Yoruba elements mixed in it. So sometimes when they invoke in Yoruba spirits, they call them the Nagos. So you would see it, but it's more the homie, right? It's more Fona Ewe. So if you talk about the pure Yoruba territories, yeah, in Latin America, it's easier to practice the religion if you see it in the music, right, which is visible. It's just a less stigma practicing it there, right? So I think because of that, that's not all. It's not the only reason, but that's a part of it. Is that the Yoruba spirituality tends to be more visible out of all the A.T.Rs and the sport for whatever reason. Now, for me, I don't think that's good. I don't think that's bad. I'm mixed on it. The reason why I say I'm mixed on it is just because, for this fact, a lot of, like, because the Yoruba now is so dominant, right, or Yoruba spirituality is so dominant, sometimes some things have been rewritten, right? So, for instance, people could argue it, but a lot of slaves probably came from the Sangomi region of Africa, which is Senegal, Guinea, um, Ivory Coast, right? And then if it's not from Sengambia, it's going to be from Central Africa, right? So those were the first two groups of slaves, like from regions, to come here in huge flocks, right? And what happened? The Yoruba came later on because the Yoruba was a bigger empire to some extent, more powerful, and they were actually slave traders, right? So eventually they got enslaved too, but they came later on, right? But when they came later on, that story is repackaged by the fact that people would say, well, the Yoruba system is so dominant, or the Yoruba culture is so dominant that that's the only reason why you see it in other African, like in other diaspora nations, right? So, for instance, if you go to Cuba, you're gonna see it because it's the dominant tribe. So, if the Yoruba go to Cuba, they're gonna dominate all other tribes. Now, I'm not gonna say that's wrong. There's not some truth in that because they were such a big empire. It's kind of like if you're from North America, Yeah, you could be from Canada, from Mexico, but any Canadian and Mexican is gonna probably still know U.S. culture because U.S. is a dominant culture. Now, don't get me wrong, the Dahomey Empire, the Khan Empire, they could rival the Yoruba Empire easily, right? But outside those two, they would, without question, the superpower. So you can see how other tribes would probably know Yoruba culture at least a little bit. So if surrounded by them or even living amongst them, you can see how that culture may dominate, right? Eventually, or become the one that's the most visible. But that's not entirely true. There's some truth in that, but a lot of other parts of it is the fact that Yoruba came later on. So by the time the Yoruba started coming in, the slave masters weren't as vicious in terms of suppressing the culture as much. So then that's why even in Brazil and Cuba, where Brazil actually in both regions they probably have heavier doses of Central African. Cuba might actually be, you have a lot of people from Sierra Leone there as well, but Yoruba is dominant because that was the last slaves to come, or they came later on. So because of that, their culture is going to be more prevalent. That's a big difference, and I think sometimes that gets understated, right? So that happens where you have people who may be more dominant from the Congo, more dominant from the Sangambian regions, practicing Yoruba spirituality now. Um, that not gonna say that's bad, but what happens is at times because these systems are very blood based, that can hurt your ability to call on those energies if you're practicing them the traditional way. Doesn't mean you can't call on it, but it could diminish it. There's no question. So because of that, I have a little bit where I say, okay, well, there's some negative consequences for that, but at the same time, I would give the Yuba system this. They, the energies of what's represented in that system tends to be the most open. So they tend to be, it's easier, they tend to be more open. So they tend to be, it's easier to fuse that with other systems. Now, if you listen to my videos for a while, you may know I'm not a big fan of fusing two systems together, especially if you don't know what you're doing. But I would say this, those systems tend to be, or the gods, or whatever you want to call it, the intelligences, probably better, or the spirits of those systems, are open in general. So because they're so open, it's probably easier for them to mix with different tribes. And then as well as outside of different tribes, start to mix with, you know, Catholicism. It's easier for it to do it. So that's why you would see it more in that sense. So that's why I said I'm mixed on it, but at the same time, still probably more good than bad. I just think that at times the stories kind of get mixed, or politics start to come into it, and because of that, like for instance, a lot of people who practice the Ifa system may not understand that in general, the systems from Fauna and Aware are probably older, right? I know some people may not like that, but for the most part, it's probably older. Now, being that it's older doesn't mean that you're supposed to be practicing it, but I do think that the stories should be told, and sugarcoating it or not revealing certain things because you get your feelings hurt is not the way to go, especially when it comes to spirituality, right? But that's neither here nor there. I just wanted to get it out the way. When we're dealing with the Ifa system in general, it's a very beautiful system. No question. It teaches you how to, because it basically, it's a system that's centered around the Orishas, who are the emissaries of God, right? So you could look at it as there's a supreme divine force, and Orishas are simpler versions of that force that's reflected in nature. So when you bond with Orishas, in theory, if you do it correctly, you're supposed to bond with nature. And I've always said spirituality is about integrating with your environment, right? So one of the key differences that you would see with the Orisha system or the Ifa system is it's spread all over the world. So a lot of times what actually happens is, like, there was actually a story or legend where Abatala, one of the high gods of the Ifa system, gets pushed over a cliff, right? And when he gets pushed over a cliff, he breaks up in a whole bunch of pieces. And Unmila, which is like the high priest, puts all the pieces back together. But when he puts all the pieces back together, some of it still can't be recovered. And some people interpret that as basically the fact that the Ifa's base spiritual system is now going to be spread out all over the world. And even though Nigeria is the mother base, is where it started, there would be, I guess you could say, the other regions that it spreads to bring something to the table as well, because it evolved differently. So sometimes if you want to get supreme truth, I'm not gonna say you have to go to all these places mixed, because if you come up with a one style of practicing Ifa, I'm not gonna say you should change that, but you should at least know how other people practice it. So, for example, Cuba, Brazil, Puerto Rico, and Trinidad, I would say are the four places that, for the most part, that system is strongest in, right? And then you may have it in America as well, but because in America, it's just people from those countries bringing it to America, right? And then it spread into places like Mexico as well, where Mexico probably didn't have their own version of Ifa or Santeria until the Cubans brought it to the Veracruz region of Mexico. Um, when you factor that in those four places, it's slightly different in those four places, right? So in Brazil and Cuba, you're gonna see there's gonna be things that's a little bit different. In Cuba, um, the high priest, the babalaos, he may not see women, right? Or when it comes to Elegua or Eligua or Ixu, they're gonna the Brazilians are gonna view that energy a little bit different than the Cubans do. And if you go to Trinidad, they call it spiritual Baptist or Shango Baptist, right? Um, Orisha Baptist. And in Trinidad, you may see it mixed with Indian gods. So in all the different regions, it tends to be a little bit different. And my thing is that in America, sometimes you will get where people will say, well, I'm not from those, especially because Trinidad is the only the other three territories are Latin based. So you might have people who would say, well, I'm not from those cultures, so I'm going to take it and flip it, and I'm going to do my own thing, or I'm going to practice it the way it was practiced in Africa, which I respect. But at the same time, I think people don't really understand, and this is one thing I think that, in my opinion, Voodoo has done a lot better. Voodoo has adapted to the landmass where Voodoo is, right? So when you look at Voodoo and they have like the petrol spirits, or you have certain spirits that are from Haiti, right, which are more Taino-based spirits, they adapted to their land better, right? So sometimes it's not about just saying, well, I'm going to practice it exactly the way it was practiced, let's say in Nigeria, because Nigeria is still different in terms of energetically than Chicago is, or Detroit is, or Panama is, right? So if you're talking about the philosophy of it, I can see it. But if you're talking about in terms of invoking that energy, there may be certain differences that you're not taking into account. That's the difference. So that's why I say, even no matter, because if you really understand the Ifa-based system, even in Nigeria, they're different city states. Like, Nigeria was kind of like Greece. It was run by city states. So everyone kind of does things a little bit differently, right? So even if you practice an Ifa, you go from different city to city. It may, even back in ancient times, it may be a little bit different. So at the same time, I think what people should realize, so one obvious example of a difference. In the Americas, you see it tends to be centered around the 7 African powers. In Nigeria, definitely depending on where you're from, there's going to be, outside of Eligua, right? Outside of him, right? There's no quick, because he's the king in the sense that everyone has to go through him. But outside him, the Orisha that you might primarily invoke tends to be related to where you're from. Whereas in the Americas, it's a 7 powers. So there are a lot of Orishas that might be, Africans might have hundreds of Orishas. Where in America, they even tend to try to put each Orisha under the one of those 7. And I'm not saying that's good, I'm not saying that's bad, but it just shows you how the systems have evolved. And when you understand what Orishas are, it's like, so the big question is, this system is centered around Orishas. What exactly are the Orishas? And the best way I could describe the Orishas as spirits or intelligences that live in another realm, right? That access this realm primarily through your mind. Because what happens is, the same way how in astrology we talk about there's 7 planetary powers, right? From Saturn to Earth. If you're going under how the system evolved in the Americas, and you say, well, there's 7 African powers. Those 7 planetary powers are those powers outside the human construct. So meaning, when those 7 energies interact with our realm, right, or what the planets represent, they change a little bit, right? So Earth is unique because Earth has a bit of the seven in her, right? So there's a bit of Saturn on Earth, there's a bit of what Jupiter represents on Earth, there's a bit of what Mars represents on Earth, there's a bit of what Venus represents on Earth. That bit of what those energies get represented on Earth, in some ways, is a reflection of the Orishas. Now, the Orishas might be that energy mixed with the Yoruba cultural spirit, right? So it gets cut in half, where, let's say, example, Venetian energy interacts with the Earth, right? Earth has its own reflection of Venetian energy, right? So Venetian, when we say Venus in astrology or even in psychology, that's the pure version, right? When it comes to Earth, well, Earth has a copy of that energy as well. What ends up happening is that when you say Oshun, right? Oshun is that energy fused in with the Nigerian or the Yoruba cultural mind. So those seven powers. So when someone says those seven powers are only archetypes, they're not wrong in the sense that those seven powers, it's just that the person might have a limited understanding of what the human mind is. The human mind is a portal, right? So when those seven powers interact with this dimension through the human mind. And if you're related to them by blood, even better, right? And the blood thing comes in as well because that's why some lineages of those systems might practice animal sacrifice because blood has energy as well. So they can interact through the mind and through the blood. So sometimes animal sacrifice can enhance certain things. Animal sacrifice is what a lot of people know it as, but that's not as prevalent as people think anyway, right? But the thing is, when you understand that Orishas are these energies that exist in a separate realm and they communicate with us through the divination systems, they communicate with us through the music, they communicate with us even through the culture being created by, Yoruba-based culture and its counterparts in the diaspora, is tied into the Yorubas, tied into the Orishas. They create that culture. So when you bond with that culture, when you bond with the music, when you bond with, in general, right, through the blood that exists in some of you guys, they can communicate with this realm because of that vehicle. The mind being the primary reason, they could communicate through the mind. So just like the Earth has a smaller version of those seven powers on Earth, the mind has a version of those seven powers within it. So yes, on one level, Oshun is an archetype that exists within you. But on another level, there is an intelligence that you can classify as Oshun that communicates with you through the mind as well. Just even to say how it sounds more complicated than it is, human body has water, right? So we have water in the body. The body tends to be 70% water, but yet we have water outside the body. Just like how we have water in space. Some people think water actually got to the Earth from space. It's the same exact thing. So understanding that is also understanding why, for instance, in its sister systems, like let's say Palo tends to work faster because Palo is more centered around the dead. Palo is more centered around the Earth. So we're on the Earth. So because we're on the Earth, it's natural that Palo would work faster. Because Orishas are actually intelligences that's in another realm that interacts through the vehicle of your mind. And of course, you can enhance it by the drum. You can enhance it by the music. You can enhance it by blood as well. Because don't forget what blood is. Blood is a liquid, right? And all liquids, water is the greatest solvent, right? It's the best example of a liquid. Water copies your thoughts. But guess what? Your blood copies your thoughts as well. So if you hear this and say, well, isn't it primarily through blood? Blood copies your thoughts, right? So the reason why, if they can interact with your mind, yeah, they can interact with your blood too, or the blood of an animal. So that's what it is, basically. They're in a separate place. Your mind taps into that place, and they give you guidance through that. That's it. And because of that, and because in a sense, the Ashe, it's this primordial energy that's all throughout nature, and they're kind of like basically forces that Ashe breaks up into different parts, right? When you bond with them, if you do it right, you bond with nature. So then, in a sense, all of a sudden, if you say, well, Yamaya, right, is our mother, then you research, you realize all humans come from water anyway. All species come from water. All carbon-based life forms eventually come from water. So then you start to say, wow, there's actually a lot of science in that. If I say Yamaya is my mother, the mother of humanity, literally science verifies that. And Yamaya is what? Salt water. So in a lot of ways, sometimes what happens is this helps you connect the Orishas, or seeing the forces in that form, is a simpler way of connecting to nature. And I think one of the reasons why it's actually still a very popular ATR is because they tend to take on a very human-like form, or it's easier to identify them with a human construct. In voodoo, and again, this is not me comparing or me saying Ifa is better than voodoo, right? Because I'm gonna make a separate video for voodoo. But in voodoo, you tend to have sometimes feline loas or serpent loas. The loas, in general, because voodoos come from an older lineage, it goes in times way before the human construct was even started, right? So it tends to be a much more complex system. So that's why sometimes it gets to be sometimes confusing for people, where the Orisha-based system, those forces have a very demigod type feel to them. And again, a lot of times people would say the concept of God or gods came from the Greek, right? So if I say God or demigods, you would have some people who don't practice, because what ends up happening is a lot of people might practice the philosophy of these systems, but they don't practice the system energetically, right? They don't actually do, they might read up on it, but they don't deal with the energy itself, right? So sometimes when that happens, it becomes a philosophical battle, right? So if I say gods, they say that's the Greek, that's not what the Yoruba believed. But then realistically, what we're saying is the Yoruba believed in the supreme force and the minor forces. So if you want to call the minor forces gods, you could, right? But it's probably better to say force instead of gods. I do agree. But at the same time, sometimes people kind of get into semantics. Because in general, when you understand, when you compare, because that's why for me, if you're going to practice the ATR, it's still good to read up on other ATRs or other African traditional systems, just so you can see the difference between how certain systems are practiced. In other systems, like the normals tend to be more fish gods, right? Or fish deities, or spirits that's more dealing with the water, right? From Mali. Obia, the Abasoms tend to be, again, more water creatures, right? Voodoo, you tend to have the Mamawatas, water creatures. You have feline loa, you have serpent loa. But the Orisha is a much more human experience. Not saying those forces are human, but they're more human-like. So because of that, I think the average person tends to flock to that a lot easier. And even if your future is in another ATR, I do think studying the Ifa-based system for all people, whether you practice it or not, if you're interested in ATR, is a good gateway to get you interested into the ATR that you feel most comfortable with. Like for me, I give you a perfect example. For me, the Yoruba or Ifa, even though I'm more into Igbo, the Igbo-based system, right? Or Igbo-based spirituality, or Central African-based spirituality, or even spirituality from the Sengambian region, right? That's more me. But the Ifa system or the Yoruba spirituality got me introduced to African spirituality in general. And I actually do think a lot of people will have that same experience. So whether you've finished practicing them doesn't really make a difference. I still do think for a lot of you guys that will be your initiate gateway, or that will be the gateway that initiates you into African-based systems. So you ask me questions about Ifa. Hope that helps. Till next time. Peace.